It began in a small London cafe, an ordinary afternoon, a waiter, a cup of tea, and a single silver spoon. But when the steam cleared, the reflection in that spoon had changed. Moments before, a man was sitting there, calm, alive, very real, and then he was gone. No one saw him leave. No door opened, no sound was heard, yet his image vanished, as if reality itself had blinked. When the police failed to explain it, only one man was called Sherlock Holmes. And to him, that spoon wasn't a mystery. It was a clue. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it down in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a single twist from London's strangest cases. Now, pick up your cup of tea, settle in, and prepare to lose yourself in today's story, Sherlock Holmes and the Man Who Vanished from a Spoon. Chapter 1. The Man Who Vanished from a Spoon. It was a blustery Thursday morning in the spring of 1893 when I found myself again in the company of my old friend, Sherlock Holmes. The fog, thick as broth, drifted low across Baker Street, veiling the cobblestones in a gray that matched the mood of the season. Holmes sat cross-legged in the armchair opposite mine, clad in his dressing gown, with his long fingers steepled before his aquiline nose. The tobacco haze about him seemed a part of his very person, wreathed like incense around a monk lost in thought. We had had a lull, what Holmes called draft on the winds of crime, and for the past 3 days, my companion had been alternating between nervous restlessness and absolute inertia. He had not touched his violin, nor had he ransacked his chemical corner for experiments. Instead, he had stared out the window with the air of a hound kept from the chase. That morning's edition of The Times lay folded on his lap. Holmes had read it through, then reread it, and now kept it resting, as if waiting for the ink to change and reveal some secret message. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, noting the tension in his gaze. "You have scanned that newspaper with the scrutiny of a man searching for a cipher." He tapped the folded page. "And perhaps I've found one, Watson." I leaned forward, intrigued. Holmes spread the paper and pointed to a column in the 3rd page. Mysterious disappearance. At the Savoy, prominent stage magician, Mr. Erasmus Spoon, fails to reappear during final act. Erasmus Spoon, I murmured, recognizing the name. He performed for the Prince of Wales not a month ago. His illusion with the mirror and the snake, what did they call it? The serpent's window was quite talked of. "Yes," said Holmes. "And now, it seems, the magician has become the vanishing act himself." He read aloud from the article. Mr. Erasmus Spoon, celebrated conjurer of the Savoy Theatre, failed to reappear during his final act on Wednesday evening. Witnesses, including several reputable members of the press and society, watched as Mr. Spoon stepped into a gleaming silver cabinet known as the Silver Spoon, locked himself within, and, according to standard routine, was to be released moments later by his assistant, Mr. Hugo Glint. Yet when the cabinet was opened, it was found empty. A search of the stage, trapdoors, and behind-the-scenes corridors produced no sign of the magician. Panic spread among the audience before the performance was halted. Scotland Yard has been notified. Inspector Lestrade is believed to be involved in the matter. Holmes folded the paper again, eyes alight. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "I make of it," said Holmes, rising swiftly and throwing on his coat, "that Erasmus Spoon has not vanished at all. You think it a trick, then? I think it is a mystery that begins in illusion and ends, perhaps, in something far less theatrical. Moments later, our hansom cab was speeding through the mist-draped streets of London. Holmes silent as the grave, his mind clearly already on the case. I, for my part, could not help but reflect on the strangeness of it. A man disappearing not into thin air, but from a device designed precisely to make him disappear. We arrived at the Savoy, where we were met by none other than Inspector Lestrade, looking rather flushed and, as usual, irritable. I might have known you'd come sniffing, Holmes, he said. My dear Lestrade, Holmes replied, tipping his hat, you need not sound so defensive. I'm not here to take the case from your grasp, only to assist where magic has made off with your facts. Lestrade led us backstage, where the theater's plush elegance gave way to ropes, pulleys, musty curtains, and the smell of grease paint and sawdust. A stagehand pointed us toward the infamous device, a tall, polished cabinet shaped like a gleaming spoon, its curved walls embossed with stars and swirls. The back had been removed, revealing a maze of mirrored panels and false bottoms. But no Erasmus spoon. He disappeared, said Lestrade, in front of a full audience, mind you. No trapdoors, no wires, no holes in the floor or ceiling. I've had the thing taken apart. It's just wood and mirrors. Holmes examined the cabinet closely, tracing his finger along its edges. Then he stepped inside, crouched, and peered around the back. Watson, he called. Join me, if you please. I obliged, stepping inside the device with some difficulty. From within, the world outside became warped by reflections. You see it, Holmes said, tapping a lower corner panel. There, a smudge. I squinted. Yes, grease, perhaps. Grease mixed with a thin red fiber. Stage rouge, meaning either Spoon or someone assisting him made use of this mirror in haste, possibly while crawling. He rose, brushing his coat. A man who vanishes in public wishes to reappear elsewhere in private. The trick, Watson, is that he did not vanish at all. He escaped. The question is, why? Lestrade, overhearing, snorted. You think he staged it? I think, Holmes said evenly, that Spoon intended to vanish. Yes, but I do not think he meant to disappear alone. Lestrade blinked. What do you mean, alone? Holmes looked toward the far end of the wings, where a small door stood ajar. Because, my dear Lestrade, Holmes said quietly, I believe Erasmus Spoon may not be the only person missing from last night's performance. And with that cryptic remark, he stepped into the shadows of the corridor, leaving us scrambling to follow. The echoes of the mystery growing louder with every step. Chapter 2. The assistant in shadowy followed Holmes through the narrow backstage corridor, our boots echoing softly on the planked floor, past bundles of old scenery cloth, discarded prop crates, and the oily smell of lampblack. The gaslights flickered overhead, lending the air a strange, wavering quality, as though we moved not in reality, but in some half-seen dream conjured by footlights and sleight of hand. Holmes walked quickly, his gaze flicking from doorframe to floorboard with focused intensity. Lestrade, he said, without turning, you mentioned Mr. Spoon's assistant. Hugo Glint, was it? Where is he now? Lestrade puffed slightly as he kept up. Gone, blast him. After the disappearance, he claimed it was part of the act, and told the audience to remain calm. But by the time my men arrived, he'd vanished from the premises. Vanished, Holmes echoed. A theme is emerging. We reached a cramped dressing room near the back of the theater. The brass placard on the door was tarnished, but the name was still visible. H. Glint. Holmes tested the knob, opened easily. Inside, the room was modestly appointed. A cracked mirror stood above a cluttered vanity strewn with grease paint tins, crumpled rags, and curling photographs of scantily clad chorus girls. A worn trunk sat beneath the coat-hooked wall, slightly ajar. Holmes knelt beside the trunk and examined its contents without touching them. "Costume changes," he murmured. "A green velvet tailcoat, silver thread gloves. No ordinary dresser." Glint played a role, likely more than one. Watson crossed to the mirror and studied the photographs. "His taste appears theatrical in every sense," Lestrade snorted. "If you ask me, he ran off with Spoon, a pair of scoundrels, staging some publicity stunt." Holmes said nothing. He had turned his attention to a small envelope on the windowsill, half-tucked beneath a theater program. With gloved hands, he removed the envelope and unfolded the single sheet inside. "It's a note," he said, eyes scanning. "Or rather half of one." He handed it to me. The handwriting was scrawled and incomplete, the torn edges jagged. "It must happen during the Spoon illusion. She will be seated in the third row, left aisle. Ensure the lighting distracts them, that's all." I asked. Holmes nodded. "The rest was torn away, perhaps deliberately. But we now have a new character in our drama, a woman, known to Glint or Spoon, positioned in a specific seat. Something important was to happen at the exact moment of Spoon's disappearance." He turned to Lestrade. "I'll require the guest list for last night's performance, if such a record exists." Lestrade grunted. "The theater keeps a ledger for the boxes and reserved stalls. I'll have it sent to Baker Street." "Good. And a program." Holmes took one from the dressing table and flipped through. The Silver Spoon illusion was listed last, its description breathless and vague. Lestrade had begun to pace, frustrated. "So, what now?" "We have a missing man, an absent assistant, a torn note, and an empty cabinet. But no crime not yet." Holmes looked up, and I noticed that subtle gleam in his eye, the one I had come to recognize as a prelude to revelation. "No confirmed crime," he corrected. "But we are on the edge of something unusual." He snapped shut the program and strode past us. "Come, Watson. I believe the stage manager is still about." The manager, pinched, an anxious fellow named Mr. Bramble, was found pacing near the stage curtain, chewing the corner of a handkerchief. When Holmes introduced himself, the man nearly sighed in relief. "Oh, thank heavens, Mr. Holmes. This has been a nightmare. The papers won't leave us be, and half the staff have refused to come in today. I've never seen anything like it." "Tell me about Mr. Spoon's last days," Holmes said. "Had he been behaving oddly?" Bramble hesitated. "Oddly, he was always odd. They all are, these conjurers. But yes, now that you mention it, he did seem nervous. He kept checking the audience through the curtain. Said something about timing and expecting a signal. Wouldn't explain further." "Did he mention the woman in the third row?" "No," Bramble replied, confused. "But now that you say it, there was a bit of a disturbance in that area just before the finale." "What kind of disturbance?" I asked. "A gentleman became quite agitated." said the woman next to him had fainted. But when staff got to the row, there was no woman. Just an empty seat, and him looking rather pale. He left before the end, muttering something about needing air. Holmes turned on his heel. That Rother'd, left aisle. Can we see it? The theater was dark and silent, the velvet seats slumbering in orderly ranks. Holmes counted swiftly and gestured for us to stop beside a seat 3 rows from the front. He crouched beside it, withdrew a small magnifying lens from his coat, and examined the seat's underside. After a moment, he nodded to himself. Scratches recent ones. Someone knelt here, or perhaps fumbled with something attached to the base. Watson bent down beside him. Could something have been planted? Holmes straightened. Or taken. The woman never existed, door else was removed, like spoon, as part of a larger scheme. Lestrade rubbed his temples. This is starting to sound more like ghost stories than police work. Holmes did not smile. On the contrary, we are dealing with a perfectly human piece of theater, one where the curtain has only begun to rise. He turned to me, his expression calm but alert. Watson, we must locate this man who sat beside the vanished lady. His account will either clarify the illusion or dissolve it entirely. Do we know his name? Holmes tapped the theater program lightly. Not yet, but we know his seat, and from there we shall find him. And with that, we departed the theater once more, leaving the silver cabinet behind us, gleaming quietly in the dark, as though it too were waiting for someone to return. Chapter 3. The man in the third rut was not until the next morning that Holmes received the theater's guest ledger. A messenger arrived promptly at 9, bearing the thick, leather-bound volume in his arms like a priest carrying scripture. Holmes thanked him curtly and carried the book to the breakfast table, where I had only just finished buttering a scone. No fewer than 22 seats in the third row, Holmes murmured, flipping pages with a surgeon's precision. But only 6 were formally reserved. Our man is among them. He traced his finger along the names listed beside row C. Left aisle. Ah, here it is, seat C5, reserved by a Mr. Fenwick Hargrave, of 8 Mulberry Crescent, Bloomsbury. Does the name strike a chord? I asked. No, said Holmes, already reaching for his hat. But it soon will. By 10 o'clock, we were rattling through the streets of London, the city awakening around us. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing chimney pots and red brick tenements slick from the prior night's mist. Holmes remained silent for most of the journey, his hands clasped in front of him, eyes half-lidded in concentration. Mulberry Crescent proved to be a quiet street lined with narrow townhomes, their steps freshly scrubbed and iron railings gleaming. Number 8 was a tidy, respectable-looking residence, with ivy curling up the stonework and lace curtains in every window. Holmes rang the bell with the air of a man who already expected not to be welcomed. A moment later, a stiff-faced maid appeared behind the door. Yes, she said. Wary Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. We've come to speak with Mr. Fenwick Hargrave regarding the performance at the Savoy 2 nights ago. The maid's brow furrowed. I'm afraid Mr. Hargrave isn't receiving visitors. Holmes' smile was slight but firm. That may be so, but he shall receive us. Before the girl could object, Holmes stepped smoothly past her into the foyer, I following in his wake with an apologetic glance. A man's voice called from a rear chamber. Who is it, Aggie? We followed the sound and entered a drawing room done in heavy green drapery and mahogany paneling. Seated near the hearth was a man of perhaps 50, with thinning sandy hair and a florid complexion. His hands were clasped tightly around a tumbler of brandy, though the hour was still early. "I take it you are Mr. Hargrave," Holmes said, bowing slightly. "I am," the man replied, warily. "And you are?" "Sherlock Holmes. This is my associate, Dr. Watson. You were seated beside a woman who vanished during the Silver Spoon act at the Savoy Theatre. We'd be most grateful for your account." At this, Hargrave paled and clutched the arm of his chair. "I'd rather not revisit the experience. I'm a man of fragile nerves." The whole affair was deeply unsettling. Holmes gave him a long, unreadable look. "Nevertheless, Mr. Hargrave, I fear you are the only living witness to the moment in question. We must insist." Hargrave exhaled through his nose. He stared into the fire for a moment, then nodded. "She was already seated when I arrived," he said quietly. "Young, perhaps 25 or so, pale, very pale, wore a blue dress, no jewelry, no bag. She didn't look at me, didn't speak." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Did she react to the performance?" Hargrave shook his head. "Not once." It was eerie. The theater was dark during that last illusion, and for a moment the spotlight shifted. When it returned, she was gone. "And did you hear anything?" Holmes asked. "A whisper, movement, the rustle of clothing." Hargrave's eyes flicked upward. "There was a scent," I echoed. "Lilacs. Very faint, but unmistakable. It lingered after she disappeared." Holmes turned, hands clasped behind his back, and slowly paced the room. "Do you suffer from delusions, Mr. Hargrave?" The man stiffened. "Certainly not." "Then you're certain this woman existed? That you were not mistaken? No trick of the lighting?" Hargrave's voice hardened. "She was real. As real as I am now. I would swear it. Yet no one else saw her," Holmes said, turning. "And the seat in which she sat bore marks of tampering." Hargrave's face grew blotchy. "You think I imagined her?" Holmes' voice remained calm. "I think someone wished her not to be seen." He paused, then stepped closer. "Have you ever met Mr. Erasmus Spoon or Mr. Hugo Glint before the performance?" Hargrave blinked. "No. I wait. That name, Glint, I believe I've heard it. In what context?" Hargrave looked uncertain. "A social club. The Bell and Mortar, in Paddington. A friend mentioned him, said Glint owed money, considerable money, gambling, I believe." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Interesting. Did your friend mention to whom this debt was owed?" "I believe the name was Cartwright, or something like that." Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "You have been most helpful, Mr. Hargrave. Should you recall anything else, however small, you may leave a message for me at Baker Street." Hargrave nodded, already looking relieved to see us leave. Outside, Holmes paused on the front steps, his expression unreadable. "So the assistant was in debt," I said. "You think he orchestrated the disappearance?" "I think, Watson," Holmes replied slowly, "that we now have motive for one man to vanish and for another to be made to vanish." He raised a finger. "Consider this. A magician performs a vanishing act, but his assistant, in debt to criminals, disappears as well. A woman no one else can prove existed sits beside a man who swears she was real, and leaves behind nothing but the scent of lilacs. We are either dealing with an elaborate illusion or a crime wrapped within one. And where do we go next? Holmes hailed a passing cab. To Paddington, the Bell and Mortar Club. Let us learn more about Mr. Glint's gambling before someone ensures we learn nothing at all. Chapter 4. Shadows at the Bell and Mortar. Bell and Mortar proved to be one of those London establishments that survived by knowing exactly when not to ask questions. Tucked between a tobacconist and a shuttered milliner's shop in a quiet stretch of Paddington, it wore an unimpressive exterior plain brick, sooty windows, a rusted iron sign swinging on bent hinges. But as Holmes and I stepped through the door, it became clear that within these unimposing walls, secrets moved like smoke. The interior was dim and close, with the smell of stale cigars and spilled port. A few men hunched over their drinks, eyes darting toward the door before returning to their tankards. A fire sputtered in a narrow grate beneath a portrait of the Queen that had faded into a pale, watchful ghost. Holmes removed his gloves and approached the bar with the nonchalant grace of a regular. "We're looking for a gentleman who frequents your tables," he said to the barman, a heavy-set man with an apron stained by time. Name of Hugo Glint. The barman's eyes narrowed. "Never heard of him." Holmes smiled faintly. "That's curious. He owes rather a lot of money to a man connected to this establishment. Cartwriter, was it Cartwell?" The man's shoulders stiffened. "Don't know anything about that, either." Holmes leaned closer. "My friend here is a medical man," he said, gesturing to me, "and quite adept at recognizing the early symptoms of lead poisoning should any brass-buttoned members of Scotland Yard decide to inspect your whiskey jugs." The barman's face soured. "Wait here," he muttered, then disappeared through a curtain near the back. Holmes turned to me with a faint smirk. "A gentle threat, Watson, but sufficient. We've touched the correct nerves." Moments later, the curtain parted again and a new figure emerged. He was tall and lean, with a face sharpened by hunger and a mouth that seldom remembered how to smile. His suit was dark and overly precise, as if pressed by calculation. He asked. His voice was low, smooth, and laced with suspicion. "I am," said Holmes, "Sherlock Holmes." "And you are?" The man hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. "Cartwell. I've heard of you." "Then you know I rarely ask questions without purpose." Cartwell crossed his arms. "Glint was deep in my pocket. I don't know what he earned helping that Ponzi magician vanish into boxes, but it wasn't enough. He owed me 200 sovereigns. Did he try to repay it?" Holmes asked. "No," Cartwell spat. "He tried to disappear. And now, well, maybe he did." Holmes' brows lifted. "You seem remarkably unconcerned." Cartwell's lips curled. "Because I know what men like Glint don't. You can run, but debt travels." Holmes nodded slowly. "So Glint vanishes. Coincidentally, so does Spoon. A woman is planted in the audience to disappear, and all of this takes place during a carefully timed illusion." Cartwell eyed him warily. "You think Glint staged it to get away?" "I think someone staged it," Holmes replied. "Tell me, did Glint ever mention a woman?" "A collaborator," Cartwell considered. "Only ever saw him with one sharp-looking girl. Dancer type. Black hair, always wore gloves. Came here twice. They argued like crows. I think she was done with him. Did you catch her name?" "No," Cartwell said, then paused. "Wait, he called her Velda once, or something like it." said she, was the real trick. Didn't mean it kindly. Holmes nodded. You've been most helpful. Helpful, Cartwell growled. If you find Glint before I do, tell him I still own his fingers. We departed the Bell and Mortar, the scent of smoke and resentment still clinging to our coats. Holmes walked briskly toward the corner, the wind now rising in earnest. We must locate this Velda, he said. If she exists, she may have played the part of the vanishing woman. Glint would have needed someone with stage presence, nerve, and above all trust. But why vanish in front of an audience? I asked. It's one thing to flee, another to orchestrate such theater. Holmes nodded. Because, Watson, vanishing on stage buys you two things, time and doubt. Time to escape, doubt to cloud pursuit. He slowed as we reached a cab stand. But here is the deeper concern. What if Glint did not escape? I looked at him, puzzled. You mean Spoon betrayed him? I mean, Holmes said, voice lowering, that perhaps Glint did not vanish as planned. Perhaps someone else took advantage of the performance. As we stepped into the cab and gave the driver directions back to Baker Street, Holmes leaned back, folding his arms. Cartwell may be brutish, he said, but not stupid. If Glint had run to avoid debt, Cartwell would have found him more, left a trail of bruised intermediaries. But there is no trail, no sign of planning, no accounts emptied, no railway ticket bought. Glint was not running. I suspect he was lured by Spoon, possibly, or by the same hand that arranged for the woman in row C to vanish. Back at Baker Street, a telegram was waiting on the hall table. Holmes read it quickly and handed it to me. From Inspector Lestrade, preliminary search of Spoon's belongings. Revealed burned fabric scraps and powder residue in his dressing room stove. Smell of lilacs present, nothing more at present. Will send full report. The scent again, I muttered. It can't be coincidence. No, Holmes said. And burned fabric suggests a costume was destroyed. He moved to the fireplace and lit a fresh pipe. Gaze darkening. We are watching the outer layers of a trick, Watson. A magician draws the eye to one hand while the other performs the real act. We must stop watching the stage. He exhaled a long plume of smoke. We must now ask who was in the audience, and why. And as the lamplight deepened across the cluttered study, I saw a strange glint in Holmes' inot of certainty, but of pursuit. The game, as ever, had only just begun. Chapter 5. A Name from the Wings. That evening, Holmes did not touch his supper. He paced the sitting room of Baker Street with measured urgency, puffing steadily at his pipe, the smoke curling upward like the thoughts gathering in his mind. I had learned long ago not to interrupt him during such periods of concentrated silence. Instead, I watched the firelight flicker against the spines of our well-worn books and allowed my thoughts to dwell on the vanishing woman, the unpaid debts, and the inexplicable scent of lilacs. Finally, Holmes stopped pacing and turned abruptly. "Watson," he said, "you recall the manager of the Savoytha, anxious fellow, Mr. Bramble. Of course, he mentioned nothing of Glint's past engagements. Yet an assistant magician does not appear out of thin air. Glint must have worked other stages, and those stages may have recorded his affiliations. You propose to contact other theaters?" "No," Holmes said with a glint in his eye. "I propose we speak to someone who knows them all." He crossed the room and retrieved a thin, paper-bound volume from our reference shelf. It was Green's Register of London Performers, a yearly digest listing all entertainers, acts, and bookings across London's performance venues. Flipping rapidly through the index, Holmes found what he was after. Glint, Hugo, assistant, illusionist, touring circuits 1889 to 1891, resident at Savoy from March 1892, before Spoon. Glint worked with one Jasper Crowsley, Holmes said, a middling conjurer who headlined music halls. His last known address Barrack Street, Soho. We arrived there shortly before 9. The area was dimly lit and smelled of coal smoke and rain. Number 43 was a boarding house with sagging shutters and peeling paint. But a brass plate near the bell still read J. Crowsley. A stout woman answered the door, eyeing us suspiciously until Holmes presented his card. Mr. Crowsley's in the rear parlor, she said. You'll find him with his whiskey and ghosts. The parlor was musty, its drapes drawn, and its furniture covered in faded fabric. Seated beside a dusty pianoforte was an older man with long gray hair, a velvet cravat, and a beard that might once have been auburn. A cracked tumbler of amber liquid rested on his knee. He did not rise as we entered. You've come about Hugo, he said without preamble. Holmes inclined his head. We have. He has vanished. Wouldn't be the first time, Crowsley muttered. He was always a slippery fellow. Fast with cards, faster with lies. But talented, I'll grant him that. You worked with him for nearly 2 years, Crowsley said. Taught him everything I knew. But he had ambition. Wanted bigger stages, bigger risks. That's when he joined Erasmus Spoon. Holmes leaned slightly forward. Did he ever mention a woman named Velda? Crowsley laughed dry, bitter. Ah, yes. Velda Sin. If Glint was ambition, she was fury bottled in silk. She was a chorus girl at the pavilion when they met. They performed an act together, The Lady and the Knife. It ended badly. How badly? I asked. She left the act, Crowsley said, but not before accusing Glint. Said he stole her ideas, her designs. Claimed he'd taken something from her that couldn't be replaced. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Designs. She dabbled in mechanics, Crowsley said. Had a mind for hinges and trapdoors. There was talk she helped Glint modify a disappearing cabinet he used. Called it the Mirror Spoon or something daft. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. I could see the fire catching in his mind. Do you know where she is now? Holmes asked. Crowsley swirled his drink. Haven't seen her in 2 years, but I heard she took up designing costumes for touring productions. A traveling company, I think. They sometimes winter at the old Albion Theatre on Cowcross Street. We departed swiftly, Holmes energized by the new lead. As we made our way through the darkening city, he spoke in quick, precise bursts. We now see the outline of a deeper plot, Watson. Glint, in debt and desperate. Spoon, increasingly nervous. A woman with mechanical knowledge and motive for revenge. A modified cabinet, a scent left as a signature, and to vanishing Glint, and a woman no one else can prove existed. But why vanish Spoon? I asked. He was the star. Perhaps, Holmes replied grimly, he was the target. By the time we reached the Albion Theatre, the street lamps had begun to flicker to life. The theatre stood in quiet decay, closed for renovation. Its doors boarded but not locked. We found a narrow side entrance ajar and slipped through. The interior was cloaked in dust and silence. Faint moonlight filtered through the upper windows, casting angular shadows on the stage. Holmes moved like a man returning to a half-forgotten dream. He crossed the boards and examined the backstage area, pulling open drawers, peering into costume racks. His gaze methodical. At last, he stopped before a wooden trunk. The lock was broken. Inside was a bundle of blue satin, pressed flat and carefully folded. Holmes lifted it gently. "The dress," he whispered. "The one Hargrave described. The disappearing woman's costume." Beneath it, he found a crumpled envelope. He opened it and withdrew a single photograph, faded but unmistakable. It showed Glint and a woman standing beside a large metallic cabinet, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Velda Sin," Holmes murmured. "And behind them what appears to be an early version of the silver spoon." Just then, a soft creak echoed from the balcony above. We froze. Holmes looked up, eyes narrowing. A figure moved in the shadows, too distant to discern, but watching. "Stay back," Holmes whispered, tucking the photo into his coat. "We are not alone, Watson." And as the stage light caught a glint of something, a metallic thread, or perhaps the barrel of a pistol, we knew that the mystery had stepped out of the past and was watching us from the wings. Chapter 6: The Silent Balcony. The figure in the balcony did not move. It stood with unnatural stillness, half concealed behind the heavy drapery that framed the decaying theater box. Only a flicker of silver had betrayed its presence, whether watch, chain, or weapon. I could not tell. Holmes motioned me wordlessly behind a stack of scenery boards near the proscenium arch. From this angle, we could no longer see the figure clearly, but we could hear its light footfalls, shifting weight, the faintest rasp of breath. "We're being observed," I whispered. "Yes," Holmes said, "and I dare say it is not an idle interest." He crouched lower and drew a small mirror from his inner coat pocket, an old trick of his, and angled it upward to catch the reflection from above. He studied it for several long seconds, then exhaled through his nose. "Female," he murmured, "slim build. Likely our Velda." Holmes tucked the mirror away. "She matches the photograph, and more importantly, she left the dress and photo where we would find them. She wants us to chase." A sudden metallic click echoed from the upper level. We ducked. "Revolver," Holmes muttered, "or the sound of one being readied." "Do we retreat?" I asked. "Heart, THUDDING, double quotes. No, Watson. We rise." And with that, Holmes was up and moving, not toward the exit, but toward the side staircase that curled up behind the stage to the private boxes. I followed at once, careful with each footfall. The stairs creaked abominably, but the echo in the vast, empty hall masked the sound. When we reached the first tier, Holmes motioned me to flank left while he veered to the right. I crept forward along the narrow corridor that ringed the theater's upper floor. Dust lay thick along the banister, broken here and there by recent smudged fingerprints. Suddenly, Holmes' voice rang, out measured but clear. "Miss Sin," he called, "we have no wish to harm you, but you have orchestrated a disappearance, a deception, and perhaps a death. You will not vanish again without answers." There was a pause. Then, "I didn't kill anyone," came the voice from above. It was sharp, not fearful, a voice more accustomed to command than confession. Holmes turned toward the box beside us. Then explain why Spoon is gone, why Glint is gone, and why you are haunting theaters like a ghost from the playbill. The curtain in the box rustled slightly. I raised my revolver instinctively, but Holmes raised a hand. I was supposed to make Glint vanish, Velda said, stepping into the half-light. Her face was pale, framed by a cascade of dark hair pinned severely back. She held no weapon, but her hand trembled at her side. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But something went wrong. Holmes stepped forward cautiously. Did Spoon know? Not at first, she said. Glint came to me weeks ago, said he had debts, said he needed an escapes, something dramatic. I built the second panel for the cabinet. He'd slip out through a false mirror and leave Spoon to finish the act. But he didn't leave the theater, Holmes said. There's no record, no sightings, no departure. Velda nodded slowly. Because he never made it out of the cabinet. A chill crept through me. Are you saying he died inside? No, she said. I mean, I don't know. I was waiting for him backstage. He was meant to slide through the panel while Spoon distracted the crowd. But the cabinet opened and no one came out. I thought he'd gone another way, but he was just gone. Did Spoon see you that night? Holmes asked. Velda shook her head. I stayed hidden. It was meant to look like magic. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Why plant the dress and the photograph for us to find? Because now Spoon is missing too. And I didn't arrange that. Holmes stepped into the box, regarding her closely. You must have suspected something else was happening. Something beyond Glint's scheme. Velda's voice softened. I thought Spoon had outwitted us both, used my trick to vanish himself. I hated him, Mr. Holmes. I won't deny it. He stole Glint's loyalty, stole my designs, made me into a ghost in my own craft. But I didn't kill him. I didn't kill anyone. Holmes tilted his head. Then who did? She looked away, biting her lip. There was someone else in the theater that night. I caught a glimpse. A mantle, broad, dark overcoat. I thought it was Cartwell. Glint's creditor, I murmured. He was watching from the upper stalls. Not clapping, not smiling, just watching. Holmes's brow furrowed. And you didn't go to the police? A bitter laugh escaped her lips. With my record, with the plans for the cabinet traced back to me, they'd never believe it wasn't murder. Holmes folded his arms, staring out into the dark theater. You understand, Miss Sin, that your presence here, your silence, has tangled an already knotted affair. You have become a ghost of your own invention. She met his eyes. What would you have me do? Tell me everything, from the beginning, every detail of the trick, every movement, every handoff, every partner. Velda hesitated and then nodded. There's something else, she said slowly. Something I didn't include in the plan. The mirror panel. Glint asked me to build it with a locking catch. One that only released from inside. Holmes's face went still. And why would he request that? Velda swallowed. He said, he didn't trust Spoon. A silence hung between us. Then Holmes turned to me, voice low but firm. Watson, we must examine that cabinet again, immediately. Back to the Savoy. No, not the stage cabinet. The original. The one in the photograph. The prototype. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Yes, if it still exists. It may hold the answer Spoon never wanted us to find. And as we descended the creaking stairs once more, The theater around us felt darker than before, as though something unseen still lingered between the wings and whispered behind the velvet curtain. Chapter 7. The Prototype in Dusta. Rain returned as we emerged from the Albion Theatre, not in torrents, but in a persistent gray mist that clung to the streets like an unwanted guest. Holmes walked quickly, collar turned up, his eyes dark with thought. "We'll need to locate the prototype cabinet," he said, speaking more to the mist than to me. "The one from the photograph. It may be the only thing left untouched by illusion." "But where would it be?" I asked. "Surely Spoon didn't keep it once the silver spoon illusion was perfected." Holmes gave a tight nod. "He likely did not. But Velda might have." Indeed, Velda Sin had agreed to wait at the Albion while Holmes and I made inquiries. She was wary of police involvement, and Holmes, for reasons he did not share but I well understood, seemed content to keep her under observation rather than in a cell. We first returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent no more than 10 minutes rifling through our case scrapbooks, newspaper clippings, and an aging theater registry. His search paused on an article from the Pall Mall Gazette, dated February of the previous year. "Local workshop catches fire in Whitechapel stage mechanics invention lost in blaze." The workshop of a Miss Velda Sin, formerly of the Pavilion Theatre, suffered damage in what authorities believe to have been an accidental fire. Miss Sin, a designer of stage illusions, was not present at the time. Witnesses claim that a large silver cabinet had been moved from the property just days before the incident. Holmes jabbed the article with his finger. "There, she moved it before the fire. So where did it go?" Holmes folded the clipping. "Let us ask her." We returned at once to the Albion, where Velda awaited us in a corner of the now familiar stage. She had changed into a dark traveling cloak, her face worn from the strain of memory and evasion. Holmes wasted no time. "The prototype," he said. "Where is it?" She blinked. "The mirror spoon." "Yes. Where did you move it after your workshop caught fire?" Velda hesitated. "A friend. A carpenter in I didn't have the heart to destroy it. He agreed to store it in his back room. I never asked for it back." Holmes's voice was gentle but firm. "We must see it tonight." She scribbled the address on a torn playbill and handed it to Holmes with trembling fingers. "Be careful," she whispered. "It was never meant to trap anyone. But when you add fear and desperation to a stage trick," Holmes nodded, already turning away, "sometimes the trick becomes real." It was near midnight when we arrived at a narrow alley off Curtin Road, where the smell of wet timber and varnish lingered thick in the air. A faint light glowed from behind the slats of a small workshop at the alley's end. The name E. Dowser Carpenter was painted on a warped wooden sign above the door. A bearded man in a flannel coat met us at the threshold. "Velda sent word you'd come," he said without ceremony. "The thing's in the back. I haven't touched it since the day she wheeled it in." The back room was cluttered with sawdust, half-finished chairs, and stacked crates. And there, beneath a canvas sheet, stood the cabinet. Holmes drew the cover away, revealing a tall, silver-plated structure, not as polished as the one from the Savoy, but unmistakably similar. Its surface was tarnished with age. The spoon-like shape was more crude, its lines angular, its hinges visible. A small lever protruded from the side, and the rear panel had a warped seam running vertically down the center. Holmes crouched and examined the base, then the hinges. He tapped one side, listening to the echo. It's hollow. He turned the lever. The rear panel clicked open. Inside was a narrow cavity barely large enough for a man to slide through. A set of inner mirrors lined the walls, giving the illusion of infinite depth. A smaller panel on the right revealed a cramped exit tunnel that led nowhere, only to a false wall. Holmes turned to the carpenter. "Has anyone tampered with this?" "No," said Dowser. "Haven't let anyone near it. I use the room for storage only." Holmes stepped inside the cabinet, his long limbs folding awkwardly, and studied the catch mechanism. "This is the locking element Velda mentioned," he called. "See here, Watson. A spring-loaded bolt can be released only from within." He withdrew a small magnifying lens from his coat and studied the edge of the bolt housing. "There are scratches here recent, as if someone tried to force it open." My blood ran cold. Then glint. Holmes stepped back out, frowning deeply. "It's possible. He could have entered the cabinet unaware that Spoon or someone else modified the mechanism. He might have found himself trapped, but where would he go?" "There's no exit." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Which means whoever locked him in didn't intend for him to come out." I stared at the mirrored interior, at the smooth panels meant to deceive the eye, and imagined a man gasping for air in that silver prison, while the audience clapped at the illusion. Holmes turned to the carpenter. "We'll need to borrow this. Have it delivered to Scotland Yard. Lestrade is expecting it." "I'll arrange it," the man said, his voice low with discomfort, back on the street. Holmes and I walked silently through the mist, our boots splashing faintly through puddles as the city slumbered. At last, I asked, "Do you think Glint is dead?" Holmes paused. "I think," he said slowly, "that the prototype reveals intention. Someone wanted Glint silenced. And if Spoon vanished afterward, it is because he knew too much or played a deeper hand than Velda." Holmes shook his head. "She may be many things, but not the final architect of this design." He looked toward the east, where dawn had begun to bleed faint light into the sky. "No, Watson, the true conjurer has not yet taken the stage." And we walked on, into the deepening mystery. Chapter 8. The Illusionist's Ledger. The following morning dawned with a pale clarity, the kind that settles on London after a night of ceaseless fog. The air was cold, crisp, and sharp as a scalpel's edge. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I descended the stairs, the remains of toast untouched beside him, a file open across his lap. "The prototype has been delivered to Scotland Yard," he said without preamble. "Lestrade telegraphed not 20 minutes ago. They'll dismantle it carefully. I expect something of interest inside, if the scent of lilac has not already faded." I poured myself a cup of coffee. "You suspect something was hidden within the cabinet?" Holmes's eyes did not leave the page. "No, Watson. I suspect someone was." He snapped the file shut and stood. "Today we visit Erasmus Spoon's home." This surprised me. "Not the theater." "We've already examined the illusion," Holmes said. "Now we must examine the illusionist." Spoon's residence, a modest yet stylish terraced house in Kensington, bore all the signs of cultivated theatrical success. A glossy black door, polished brass fittings, and freshly swept steps led to a vestibule crowded with framed playbills signed portraits, and a towering umbrella stand shaped like a top hat. We were admitted by a housekeeper, Mrs. Cray, a severe woman in her 50s, with arms like brooms and a stare that would have unsettled marble. "Mr. Spoon hasn't returned," she said grimly, dust rag clenched in her hand. "And now the papers say he's dead, vanished, or in disguise. You'd think he were the Queen of Sheba." "We're here on behalf of the investigation," Holmes said gently. "No rumors, madam, just facts." She led us upstairs to a study filled with books on stagecraft, mechanics, psychology, and illusion theory. Holmes moved swiftly, fingers dancing across spines and drawer knobs. Within minutes, he uncovered a locked metal box at the back of a desk drawer. "Watson," he said, holding it up, "a magician's secrets never travel far from the stage." The box contained a small, leather-bound ledger. Holmes opened it carefully, revealing line after line of cramped writing, coded references, and symbols, some financial, others personal. "A record of Spoon's shows," he murmured, "and, possibly, something more." I peered over his shoulder. That column ES, with a line beside each entry. "Earnings." "Unlikely," Holmes said. "Too irregular." "And these notations, SG, VS, GC, initials, perhaps, people, partners, maybe even targets." He paused on a page marked with a crimson ribbon. His brow darkened. "Here, a list of modified versions of his illusions. Each one has a date beside its Sept 1. He pointed to the entry. "Mirror, Spoon, Mod 3, split door, no return. Commissioned, no date." "Design by V.S. Velda's Mechanism," I said. "Yes," Holmes said softly, "and noted in Spoon's hand as a special commission. But no performance date, no venue, which means he never used it on stage." He flipped several pages forward and tapped his finger on a final list name. Many were crossed out, but 3 remained untouched. Glint, Velda, Cartwell. Spoon was keeping track of who knew the secret, Holmes said, and perhaps who was dangerous to him. I stared at the crossed-out names. "Do you think these are former assistants?" Holmes nodded. "Or those who became inconvenient?" We were interrupted by Mrs. Cray, who hovered in the doorway, arms folded. "There's something else," she said stiffly. "If you're looking into Spoon's business." Holmes turned. She hesitated, then crossed the room and opened a cabinet near the hearth. From it, she withdrew a small velvet pouch and handed it to Holmes. "I found this last week, hidden behind the curtains. I thought it was just stage rubbish." Holmes opened the pouch and let the contents spill into his palm. A silver key and a fine, gold chain with a small pendant shaped like a crescent moon. He held it to the light. "Do you recognize it?" I asked. "I do," Holmes said grimly. "It matches the pendant worn by the disappearing woman. Mr. Hargrave described it blue dress, no jewelry, except one item, a moon-shaped charm." I stared. "Then she was real. Or someone meant her to seem real," Holmes replied. "This pendant was left behind deliberately." He turned to Mrs. Cray. "Do you know what the key opens?" She shook her head. "It's not from this house." Holmes slipped the pendant and key back into the pouch and tied it closed. "Then it belongs to our ghost, and I believe she wants us to follow." Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid the ledger beside several clippings he had retrieved from our archive. One, in particular, caught his attention. Stagehand found dead behind theater pavilion illusion mishap suspected. Albert Knox, 32, found in apparatus storage room, crushed beneath failed trapdoor system. Authorities ruled the death accidental. Miss Veldeson, stage technician and illusion designer, was questioned and released. Holmes tapped the clipping. There's a pattern, Watson. Glint was not her first associate to disappear in proximity to a stage device, and Spoon may have feared becoming the next. You believe she killed Knox? Holmes did not answer immediately. I believe, he said finally, that Velda's designs often had more than one use. Whether she intended it or not, they've become convenient coffins. He moved to the window and gazed out at the street below, where rain began to fall again in delicate streaks. But I still don't believe she's the final hand behind this game. The ledger mentions Cartwell, and Cartwell is no illusionist. You think he forced Spoon's disappearance? I think Spoon feared him enough to keep a private record. And now that both Spoon and Glint have vanished, Cartwell is the only name left uncrossed. He turned to me with sudden urgency. Watson, prepare yourself. I believe our magician may have made one last appearance, and it's time we uncover the theater in which it happened. And so we were off again, chasing the shadows cast by smoke and mirrors where every step forward only seemed to deepen the mystery, and where the greatest trick had yet to reveal its hand. Chapter 9. Cartwell's Curtain Call. It was shortly after 2 o'clock when Holmes and I arrived outside the grim facade of Cartwell's Club the Bell and Mortar. The same fog that had cloaked our early investigations now returned in low coils, weaving through the iron railings and shrouding the door like a heavy curtain. The air smelled faintly of ash and metal, as though the street itself were bracing for confrontation. Holmes didn't bother with pretense this time. He pushed open the door and strode into the smoky warmth within, where the same surly bartender looked up with narrowed eyes and a half-lifted brow. We'll speak with Mr. Cartwell, Holmes said. The man glanced to the back, hesitated, then jerked his head toward a side room. He's here. Don't say I brought you. Holmes gave a short nod and swept toward the curtained threshold, drawing it aside with the air of a man revealing the final act of a well-rehearsed play. Inside, Cartwell sat alone at a round table, nursing a drink and a stack of worn cards. A heavy-set man in a dark waistcoat, he turned slowly as we entered, lips curling in mock amusement. Back again, Holmes, he said. I should start charging you for admission. Holmes stepped forward and placed Spoon's ledger on the table with a deliberate thump. You've been more involved than you let on, Holmes said evenly. Spoon kept your name. Not crossed out, not forgotten. Cartwell barely glanced at the book. That prove anything? It proves Spoon feared you, Holmes said. You held a debt over Glint, and you watched the performance where Glint was meant to vanish. That makes you either an accomplice or an audience to murder. Cartwell's smile remained, but his hand moved slowly toward the inside of his coat. Careful, I warned, stepping forward. Holmes raised a finger. Dr. Watson's revolver is considerably faster than whatever you have tucked there. Cartwell's hand paused. Then with, What do you want, Holmes? The truth, Holmes said. Glint planned his disappearance using a cabinet built by Veldeson. He intended to escape, to evade your reach, but he never made it out. Then Spoon vanished days later, And now you're the only man left who benefited from both silences. Cartwell leaned back, drumming thick fingers on the tabletop. Glint was a rat. He owed me more than coin. He owed me silence. Holmes's expression did not change. Silence for what? Cartwell's eyes gleamed with something close to triumph. Did you think Glint just gambled his money away? He gambled secrets, tricks. He sold half of Spoon's illusions before they ever hit the stage. He sold Velda's mirror design. To me, that caught us both off guard. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who remained composed. So you bought the trick, Holmes said, and then decided you didn't need the cellar. Cartwell shrugged. He outlived his usefulness. Holmes's tone hardened. Then you admit it. I admit nothing, Cartwell said smoothly. Men vanish all the time in this city, especially those who think they're clever, especially magicians. He stood slowly. You've got no body, no confession, and no proof. Holmes regarded him coolly. Perhaps, but I have something else. He removed the silver key and pendant from his pocket and laid them on the table. Recognize these? Cartwell's smirk faltered. He looked away too quickly. You followed Glint that night, Holmes continued. And when the trick was executed, you made certain the cabinet locked from the outside. Spoon may have discovered you afterward, or you feared he might. So you arranged for a second act. Cartwell said nothing. You had motive, access, and a working knowledge of the illusion. The only variable you could not control was Velda. She saw you that night. Cartwell laughed, short, sharp. And who'll believe her? I will, came a voice from the doorway. We turned. Velda Sin stood there, pale but composed, her arms folded tightly. She told me everything, Holmes said softly, and now she's prepared to speak to the yard. Cartwell's expression darkened. You brought her here? No, Holmes said. She followed us. For once, her timing is impeccable. For a moment, the silence in the room thickened. Cartwell looked toward the pendant on the table, then toward the door. His hand twitched. I raised my revolver instinctively. Don't. But he didn't run. He only sat again, his shoulders slumping slightly, like a man realizing his final card had been misplayed. Holmes turned to Velda. Go to Lestrade. Give him your statement. Mention the cabinet, the key, the modifications. It's enough. She nodded and left without another word. Holmes turned back to Cartwell. You may yet escape prosecution, Mr. Cartwell, but you won't escape scrutiny, and you will never hold another secret without fear it might be your own undoing. Cartwell said nothing. His eyes were on the pendant, unmoving. Outside the rain had stopped, though the air remained damp with unfinished storms. Holmes lit a cigarette as we walked, his steps unhurried for the first time in days. You believe he'll be arrested? I asked. Sooner or later, Holmes replied. But justice in cases like these isn't always found in courtrooms. It's found in consequences. And Cartwell now knows he's being watched. He paused. Velda's confession will seal the account. She was never the villain, only a pawn, as Glint was. Both played their roles, and both lost control of the script. And Spoon. Holmes looked ahead, his face unreadable. If we find a body, he said quietly, we'll find him. Until then, the illusion remains. And so we continued into the gray, the city, silent around us, holding its secrets close like a magician guarding the final twist. Just before the curtain falls. Chapter 10. The cabinet reopened. 2 days passed in quiet anticipation. Though Cartwell had not been arrested, Holmes' calculated disclosure of Velda's statement to Scotland Yard had placed a watchful net around the man. "He'll squirm before he slips," Holmes had remarked dryly. "But if he tries to vanish, we'll be ready." It was on the morning of the 3rd day that the awaited telegram arrived. Lestrade had summoned us to Scotland Yard. From Inspector Lestrade, cabinet opened. Object found. Matches Holmes' suspicions. Come at once. By the time we arrived, Lestrade was pacing the Yard's lower evidence room, his mustache bristling, his fingers smudged with grease and soot. "Thank heaven you've come," he said without preamble. "I've kept it sealed for your inspection." The prototype cabinet, retrieved from Dowser's workshop and transported carefully in parts, had been reassembled under Holmes's precise instructions. Its rear panel now stood open, revealing the hidden mechanics, the sliding mirror, the trap panel, the bolted catch. But it was what lay behind the false base that drew every eye in the room. A parcel, wrapped in oilcloth, bound with thin twine. Lestrade stepped back, clearing his throat. "We found it lodged beneath the must have been wedged there intentionally. Some bloody patience it took to spot the seam." Holmes stepped forward, hands gloved, and slowly unwrapped the package. Inside lay a small notebook, weathered but intact hand, a velvet pouch identical to the one found in Spoon's residence. Holmes opened the notebook. The first page was inscribed in a hurried hand. "If anything happens to me, this is the truth, H.G. Glint," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "Let's see what secrets the assistant chose not to perform on stage." The pages were filled with disjointed entries, notes about Spoon's temper, his manipulations, his penchant for reworking others' ideas and claiming them as his own. There were descriptions of Spoon's plans to take the Mirror Spoon illusion abroad, with Glint as a silent partner. But the tone shifted rapidly in later entries. "Spoon doesn't trust me. I can feel it. Keeps locking the cabinet from the outside as a test. Claims it's for precision. I think he wants to trap me in the trick. Velda built the locking catch. Said only I can open it. But she's grown distant. I think he's gotten to her too. Cartwell saw me before the show. Asked if I was ready to pay my debt in full. I told him it was handled. He just laughed. If I vanish, it won't be an illusion. It'll be Spoon or both." Holmes closed the notebook with slow gravity. Glint feared for his life, and rightly so. Lestrade stepped forward. "That's not all. The pouch inside contained this." He lifted a delicate skeletal ring from a small evidence dish. It was gold, with a strange insignia on the inner banda crescent moon beside an engraved V. "Another piece of the costume," I said. "The disappearing woman." Holmes turned to me. "No, Watson. This is not a costume piece. This is a token, a warning or a message. Velda left the pendant behind intentionally, but Glint left this for her." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "You think he meant for her to find it?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, and the placement of the notebook proves it. He hid it where only someone dismantling the cabinet would think to look. But the ring, he placed that to be discovered during a performance. It was intended to catch the light, to reflect." I frowned. "But no one found it during the performance." "Exactly," Holmes said grimly. Because Spoon got to the cabinet first. The Strayed rubbed his chin. So Spoon traps Glint, knowing the man fears Cartwell and intends to vanish for good. Then what? Uses the trick himself. Holmes shook his head. That's the missing piece. Why would Spoon vanish unless he too had something or someone to fear? He turned to Lestrade. We must examine Spoon's financial records. If Cartwell threatened Glint over debt, he may have threatened Spoon as well. Lestrade nodded. I'll see to it. We returned to Baker Street late that evening, the city gleaming wet with rain beneath the gas lamps. Holmes was unusually quiet, seated by the fire with the notebook open across his knees. He tapped one of the last entries again and again with his forefinger. If I vanish, won't be an illusion. Watson, he said suddenly, have you ever considered what it feels like to be buried alive only standing? I looked up from my writing. Good Lord. Inside that cabinet, he said softly, with the mirrors pressed in, with the catch locked, with the sounds of the audience muffled through polished wood and stage velvet. Glint must have realized, too late, that he wasn't vanishing at all. He was being erased. And Spoon. Holmes's gaze darkened. Spoon knew. That notebook proves Glint shared his suspicions. Spoon may have locked him in, thinking it poetic justice. Or he may have been manipulated into it by or someone else, Holmes said. Because this game has a third player. Someone who wants the illusion itself, the cabinet, the trick, the design. Someone who understands that the best way to steal a secret is to let its creators destroy each other. He leaned forward. And now, Watson, I believe that third player is preparing their final act. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes unfolded it, his eyes scanning rapidly. Then he passed it to me. From Lestrade Bank records received. Spoon made for large withdrawals in the week prior to vanishing money unaccounted for. Traced to a new theater property in Camden. Registered to a Mr. C. Rowley alias, confirmed as Cartwell. I looked up. Holmes was already rising. The game is nearly over, Watson, he said. And the stage has already been set. And with that, we gathered our coats once more and stepped into the night ward Camden, toward the truth, and toward a final curtain not yet drawn. Chapter 11. The Theater with No Name. Camden was quiet that evening. The streets bathed in amber gaslight and muffled by the steady drizzle of spring rain. Our cab rattled through the back lanes, wheels cutting thin furrows through puddled cobblestone. Holmes sat rigidly still, fingers interlaced, his gaze distant and unblinking. There's a question that continues to trouble me. Watson, he said, as the cab turned onto a narrow street. I asked, why would Spoon transfer funds to Cartwell under an alias and invest in a theater property never announced, never advertised, and never opened? To escape, I offered. To create a space where he could perform without oversight. Holmes shook his head. No, not Spoon. He lived for attention, not secrecy. This was not his stage. It was Cartwell's. Spoon only bankrolled it, willingly or otherwise. The cab rolled to a halt in front of a low brick structure tucked between a derelict furniture warehouse and a butcher's yard. The building bore no sign, no name, no lighting, only the vague outline of boarded windows and a rusting delivery door at the side. Holmes stepped out into the rain, his coat whipping about him as he examined the facade. "This was once the Morton Pavilion," he said. "Closed after the roof collapse in '89, condemned. But Cartwell has repurposed it, quite discreetly. A side entrance yielded to Holmes' lockpick in less than a minute. We stepped into a narrow hallway that smelled of damp plaster and stale varnish. The air was still, but something about the silence unsettled me too complete, too unnatural, as though the building itself held its breath. We passed through the corridor into the main theater. The space was enormous, its vaulted ceiling supported by iron trusses, its rows of seats rotted and torn. But at the center of the stage, beneath a hanging lamp, stood a new structure, sleek, polished, terrifying in its familiarity. "The silver spoon," I breathed. Holmes stepped forward, his boots scuffing the dusty boards. "A perfect replica, perhaps even improved. But it is not for magic, Watson. This version was built for something far more calculated." I followed him onto the stage. The cabinet gleamed, its panels pristine, its brass fittings newly burnished. There was no dust on it, no sign of abandonment. Someone had used it recently. Holmes examined the hinges, the rear compartment, the side lever. The same mechanism, but stronger. Reinforced catches, modified latches. "This is not illusion. This is entrapment." I turned to him. "Do you think someone is still inside?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he motioned to a control panel mounted beside the cabinet. Wires ran from it into the base of the structure. "I believe this version is operated remotely," he said grimly. "A magician's trap turned mechanical. This isn't for escape. It's for imprisonment." Just then, a footstep echoed from the rafters above. We both froze. Another footfall followed, a deliberate one, not the accidental scuffle of a squatter. Holmes looked up toward the catwalks above the stage, where a faint shadow passed across the cracked glass of a loft window. We moved quickly to the wings, climbing a narrow ladder that led to the upper levels. The boards groaned beneath us as we emerged into a viewing platform overlooking the stage. There, silhouetted against the window, stood a figure in a dark coat and bowler hat. Cartwell. His hand rested on a lever, mounted to the wall duplicate of the one wired into the cabinet below. "I thought you might come," he said. Not turning, Holmes stepped forward, voice calm. "Then you must have known you would not leave," Cartwell chuckled. "Leave, Mr. Holmes. I've already succeeded. Spoon paid me to fund this theater, but he didn't know what it would be used for." "You trapped Glint," Holmes said. "You used Spoon's illusion, Velda's design, and your own improvements. You turned a performance into a sentence." Cartwell finally turned, and I saw that same glint in his eyes, smug, defiant, cruel. Glint was a thief. Spoon was a coward. They played games with secrets they didn't understand. I only helped them finish their act. Holmes's voice sharpened. "And you kept the prototypes to bait Glint. Then you built this one to erase Spoon." Cartwell leaned against the lever. "But you have no proof. The cabinet's empty now, the trap cleaned, the books burned. Even Velda won't testify." "She already has," I said. He smiled. "Then she's next." Before either of us could react, he threw the lever down with a sudden motion. Sparks flew from the control box. Below us, the cabinet groaned and then let out a loud clang, like a vault slamming shut. Holmes sprang forward, but Cartwell was already on the move, darting along the catwalk and leaping onto the ladder. He scrambled downward toward the stage. I followed at once, revolver in hand. By the time I reached the floor, Cartwell was nearly to the accidental. Holmes stepped directly into his path. There was a flash of motion, Cartwell's blade gleaming in his hand butt. Holmes caught his wrist and twisted hard. The knife clattered to the floor. Moments later, I had him pinned against the wall. Holmes was breathing heavily, but his voice remained level. "You built your own stage, Cartwell. But you forgot one rule of magic. There's always someone watching." Police arrived not long after, summoned by Lestrade, who had been following Cartwell's financial trail and joined us once. We had secured the scene. Cartwell was arrested on the spot, but even then, Holmes was quiet, troubled. He stood before the cabinet and whispered, "Open it." The constables did, slowly, carefully. Inside lay a dark coat, and beneath it, bones, half-clad, dust-rimed, a ring on one skeletal finger, a crescent moon, engraved. "Glint," I whispered. Holmes closed his eyes for a moment. The trick was never meant to end. And as the rain thickened outside, we stood before the cabinet in silence, two men who had seen behind the curtain and found not illusion, but death. Chapter 12. The woman in smoke. The wind blew harsh that evening, slapping rain against the windows of Baker Street, as though the storm itself meant to demand entry. Holmes stood at the hearth, his silhouette framed in amber firelight, the prototype cabinet's notebook open in one hand. I watched him in silence, the weight of the Camden discovery still lingering between us like a cold draft. Cartwell had been taken into custody. The bones discovered in the replica cabinet, later confirmed to be those of Hugo Glint, had closed the first circle of this cruel illusion. Yet neither Holmes nor I felt the final curtain had dropped. "There's a final act yet to be played," Holmes said quietly, not looking up. "And I fear it is Velda who holds the last key." "She's already testified," I replied. "She's cleared her name. We owe her no further suspicion." Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "Watson, we've seen only what she's allowed us to see." Before I could press further, a knock sounded at the door. "Mrs. Hudson," admitted Inspector Lestrade, looking rain-slicked and grave. "She's gone," he said at once. Holmes did not ask who. "Velda Sin," Lestrade clarified, shutting the door behind him. "She slipped the yard's notice sometime this morning. Left no note. Her boarding room was cleared. One trunk missing, the rest untouched." Holmes closed the notebook and placed it gently on the mantel. "She never intended to stay." "She ran?" I asked. "She vanished," Holmes corrected, "as any good magician would." Lestrade sighed. "We've posted a notice at every port, but I doubt she's traveling under her own name." He left shortly after, promising to return if anything surfaced. Holmes paced the floor once more, then stopped abruptly. "Come with me, Watson." "Where are we going?" "To the Albion," he said. "There's something in the theater she wanted us to see, or perhaps something she never meant us to." The old Albion Theater was empty once more, cold, almost reverent in its silence. The dust from our last visit had not settled fully. Holmes moved as though retracing every prior step, but with sharper eyes now. Knowing the game had changed, he stopped at the dressing room once used by Velda Sin and opened the wardrobe. "Do you recall the blue satin dress?" he asked. "Of course, the one from the disappearing woman illusion." Holmes reached inside the wardrobe and drew the dress forward on its hanger. It is still here, unburned, untouched. I stared at it. But then whose dress was found in Spoon's dressing room stove? Holmes turned to me, eyes gleaming. Exactly. It was not this one. It was a duplicate, a prop, a misdirection. He reached into the hem and produced a rolled scrap of paper hidden within the inner lining. He unrolled it carefully, revealing a tightly inked diagram of the prototype cabinet, complete with annotations in Velda's hand. But one corner of the page had been overwritten in Glint's smaller, more frantic script, not the first. She's used it before. Spoon doesn't know. She said it was only for shows. But Knox, the trap failed. He knew too much. She locked it herself, my breath caught. Albert Knox, the stagehand. Crushed beneath a trapdoor, Holmes said. At the pavilion. It was ruled accidental. But this implies otherwise. I stared at the note. Then Glint knew he suspected she'd used her inventions to silence someone before. Holmes nodded. And still he trusted her. Perhaps loved her. Perhaps feared her. Either way, he entered the cabinet, knowing she had the final control. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of that sentence heavy as stone. Then Holmes turned abruptly. She did not run, Watson. She vanished to preserve the illusion. She knew the trial would cast her as a victim, or worse, a conspirator. But the moment we found the cabinet, the game ended. He looked toward the wings of the theater, as if expecting her to step out once more. She left her ring behind, her blue dress intact, her designs where we could find them, not to confess, but to curate a legacy. She didn't want to be caught. She wanted to be remembered. A low creak echoed across the stage floor. We turned sharply, half expecting a shadow or figure, but there was nothing. Only the shifting of old timber, stirred by a rising wind from a broken window high above. Holmes moved to the edge of the stage and knelt, brushing aside dust until he uncovered a single playing card. Face down, he turned it over slowly. The Queen of Spades, the magician's final bow, he murmured. I frowned. A calling card? A symbol, Holmes said, chosen deliberately. The Queen of Spades has long represented intelligence, independence, and vengeance. It's not a farewell, it's a message to whom? Holmes didn't answer. He slipped the card into his coat and stood. She's telling us she won, he said at last, and perhaps, in a way, she had. We returned to Baker Street well after midnight. Holmes declined tea, brandy, and even the pipe. Instead, sitting at the window and staring out into the murky streets, rain dripping steadily down the glass. She walked between deception and design, he said softly, balanced on the edge of her own invention. If she had not vanished, we would have exposed her fully. But in vanishing, she becomes her own trick. Will we ever find her? Holmes smiled faintly. She doesn't want to be found. And she's very, very good at disappearing. He paused. But tricks, Watson, are only magic until you know the secret. And he turned back to the fire. The Queen of Spades, resting silently on the table between us, casting its shadow on the case that had ended, not with applause, but with smoke, silence, and one final sleight of hand. Chapter 13. The Whisper Behind the Mirror. It was the following morning when I found Holmes already at work. He had returned to the cabinet's blueprints, both Spoon's version and Velda's annotated diagrams, spreading them across the dining table like a cartographer charting unexplored lands. Outside, the rain had eased, but inside Baker Street the storm of deduction continued in full. He greeted me with only a curt nod, then tapped a spot on one of the drawings with his pencil. "There's something incomplete in her design," he said. "Veldas?" I asked, sipping coffee. "Yes, look here." He pointed to a section labeled Secondary Hatch Mechanism. Glint's notes mention a locking catch. Velda's annotations match. But here she's drawn a second lever, unlabeled, no purpose given, and it wasn't present in Spoon's final build. An oversight. Holmes shook his head. "No, a deliberate omission. The mark is faint erased and redrawn. She meant for it to be seen only by someone who studied the blueprint in detail. Someone like Glint, or me." I leaned in. The lever was tucked beneath the base panel, connected to a mirror support. "What does it do?" Holmes didn't answer. He moved to the chalkboard and began sketching and overlaying engineers. Breakdown of space and force. "She designed the cabinet to be reversible," he said finally. "A switch concealed beneath the base. The performer could, if needed, alter the configuration of the internal mirror track. Not for escape but for entrapment." He stepped back, eyes scanning his own diagram. "She gave herself the power to turn the illusion into a prison at will." I sat down slowly. Then Glint was right. He suspected she had done it before. And yet, he trusted her, Holmes finished, and she betrayed that trust. Perhaps not with malice. Perhaps she saw it as justice. Perhaps as artistry. But betray him she did. The air in the room thickened. Even the fire on the hearth seemed to burn lower, its warmth dimmed by the weight of what we had uncovered. "I believe there is one final place to visit," Holmes said at last, double quotes. "Where?" He looked up, his voice quiet. "Velda's old workshop, but it was destroyed in the fire." "Not completely," he said. "The structure was damaged, yes, but the rear annex survived. According to building records, it was used for storage timber paints, scrap mirror. The fire was ruled accidental, but no cause was ever confirmed." I hesitated. "You think she left something behind?" "I think she always left something behind," Holmes said. "Clues, messages, symbols. She wanted to vanish, but also to be remembered." The charred remains of Velda's workshop stood in a crooked lane off Whitechapel Road. Its scorched brick walls rose like the skeletal ribs of some ancient ruin. The main room had collapsed inward, the roof sagging into a blackened heap of rafters and debris. But the annex, just as Holmes had predicted, remained intact. The door had been forced long ago, the lock rusted and broken. We entered cautiously. Inside was a strange hush, disturbed only by the occasional drip of water from the cracked ceiling above. Dust lay like a film of ash on every surface, and the air smelled faintly of scorched paper and old varnish. Holmes moved with purpose, scanning the walls, the shelving, the scattered remains of workshop life. He stopped at a battered writing desk tucked in the corner. It was partially burned, the lower drawers warped and blackened, but the topmost drawer opened easily. Inside were a few remnants, a scorched letter, a theater pass, and a slender, cloth-bound book wrapped in twine. Holmes untied the cord and opened the book. Its first page bore only a name, Velda Sin Private Ledger. He turned the page and began to read. The entries were sparse, at first design specifications. Mechanical sketches, notes about trap hinges and smoke pipes. But soon they shifted. Albert Knox confronted me after rehearsal. Said the trapdoor didn't align. He suspected I adjusted the platform. I hadn't, but it gave me an idea. Glint wants to run. Cartwell breathes down his neck. Spoon pressures him. I told him the cabinet could be a sanctuary. I didn't say it could also be a cell. Spoon asked about the second lever. I lied. He always thought he could improve on what he stole. There's power in misdirection. There's poetry in silence. If I vanish, it's because the world isn't ready for a woman who builds her own boxand, chooses when to leave it. Holmes closed the book gently, his expression unreadable. She saw herself not as an inventor, he said, but as a performer in her own right. Her medium wasn't illusion, it was control. She saw everyone else as part of the trick. I said quietly. Holmes nodded. Spoon was greedy. Glint was careless. Cartwell was cruel. She turned their flaws against them and stepped away before the curtain fell. He returned the ledger to the drawer, leaving it just slightly ajar. She wanted us to find this, he added. Not now, not immediately, but someday. When the dust settled, we left the workshop in silence. Outside, the clouds were beginning to part, pale sun streaking across the soot-stained brick. It felt, for the first time, as though the case had truly exhaled its final whisper, delivered from behind a mirror. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes stood once more at the window, looking out across the rain-washed rooftops. What will become of her? I asked. He didn't turn. She will vanish, and she will remain vanished. Some lives are meant to fade, not as punishment, but as performance. He turned the Queen of Spades card over in his fingers. And yet, if she does reappear on a distant stage, in a different name, it will be not to confess, but to astonish. I poured us both a brandy and handed him one. He took it, offered a quiet nod, and together we sat beside the fire. The rain now gone, the fog lifting, the mystery had ended. The cabinet was closed, but the woman in smoke had slipped through our fingers, just as she'd intended. Chapter 14. The ink that disappeared. 2 days of calm followed. Baker Street returned to its familiar rhythm. Cabs clattered down the street. Mrs. Hudson resumed her soft humming in the stairwell, and Holmes buried himself once again in chemical experiments and monographs on criminal anthropology. But the atmosphere between us had subtly changed. There was a finality to the silence, a stillness that had replaced the electric anticipation which had hovered around us for weeks. And yet, Holmes was not at ease. I observed him closely as he worked. His hands moved with precision, but his thoughts were elsewhere. On occasion, he would glance toward the Queen of Spades card, still resting by the fireplace like a relic on an altar. Late on the second evening, as I was finishing a report for my medical practice, Holmes abruptly rose from his chair and crossed to the writing desk. He pulled open the drawer, removed a thin envelope, Velda's last stand, examined it for the third time that day. There's something unfinished, Watson, he murmured. Something just beyond reach. I thought the case was closed, I said, setting down my pen. The case is closed, Holmes agreed, but not the story. He removed the Queen of Spades from the table and turned it over. On the back, nearly invisible against the stiff cardstock, was the faintest outline of writings, so faint it might have been a watermark or the residue of rubbed graphite. Holmes tilted the card toward the lamplight, then held it near the fire. Gradually, a sentence revealed itself in soft gray ink. Illusion is the one believed even after the magician is gone. He stared at it for a long moment. Invisible ink, he said softly. Heat reactive. Clever. A final message? I asked. Holmes didn't reply directly. He rose and crossed to the stack of documents Velda had left behind, the cabinet diagrams, the ledger, the notes from the workshop. He took one sheet from the Pila letter with an unfinished sentence, which we had dismissed as a rough draft. He now held it over the fire, as well as the paper warmed. Faint writing bloomed along the margins. For Holmes, if he follows the smoke, I never meant for Glint to die. The cabinet was always a door, but Cartwell turned it into a tomb. I warned Spoon. He ignored it. So I vanished before they made me vanish too. Holmes read it aloud, his voice neutral, but his expression had tightened. He turned to me. She never planned to kill Glint Watson. The trap was designed to scare him, to force him to choose safety. But Cartwell intervened. He locked the mechanism, turned fear into finality. And Spoon? I asked. Spoon suspected her, Holmes said. Feared she'd do the same to him. And she might have if only to demonstrate her control. But she didn't lock the second lever. Cartwell did. I leaned forward. Then Velda was, at least in part, innocent. Not innocent, Holmes said quietly, but not cruel. She engineered the stage, but others chose the play. He examined the writing again. If you found this, then I succeeded. I was never the assistant, never the prize inside the box. I was the one who built the box and walked away. Holmes let the letter drop into the fire. We watched as it curled and vanished in smoke. She made her exit absolute, he said. But why leave this message at all? Holmes gave the barest smile. Because, like all true magicians, she wanted applause, even if it came from only one man. I refilled our glasses in silence. The rain had returned outside, tapping against the windows in a soft, steady rhythm. Holmes took the Queen of Spades card and tucked it into a small frame on the mantel beside a carved pipe stand. For remembrance? I asked. For reference, Holmes replied. Because when the next illusion arrives, and it will, I want to be ready. We sat then, the fire crackling between us, and spoke no more of Velda Sin, nor Glint, nor the silver spoon. But I could tell that Holmes, even in stillness, remained attuned to the echo of her presence, the elusive thread of her mind, stretched across time and invention. He had solved the case, but he would never forget the woman who disappeared into her own. Desianan took the final bow when no one was watching. Chapter 15. The audience that never clapped was nearly a fortnight after the curtain had fallen on the affair of Erasmus Spoon. Hugo, Glint, and Velda Sin. The city had moved on, as it always does, newsprint filled with fresher scandals, newer tragedies. The story of a vanished magician had given way to the excitement of a foreign prince's visit and a scandal at the Railway Trust. To London, the cabinet had closed, but for Holmes, it remained slightly ajar. We were seated in our parlor one quiet evening, the fire reduced to glowing embers, when a small, nondescript envelope arrived. No stamp, no name, only the number 221 scrawled in dark ink. The envelope itself was weather-stained, the paper oddly smooth, almost theatrical in its composition. Holmes examined it closely before breaking the seal. He read the short message twice, then passed it to me without a word. "You saw the trick. But did you hear the applause?" Vi looked up sharply. "She's alive." Holmes leaned back in his chair. "Yes, Watson. But more than that, she's performing again." I reread the message, perplexed. "You think she's resurfaced?" "I think she never submerged," Holmes replied. "She has changed her costume, her venue, and perhaps even her name. But she has not ceased. Magicians do not retire. They vanish, only to return in new form." I lowered the note. "But why reach out?" "Because she needed me to know that the story remains hers," he said. "And because I was her only true witness." Holmes stood and moved toward his index of criminal archives, those meticulous files. He kept on individuals he deemed of potential future interest. He pulled a drawer labeled SZ and began leafing through. "Have you considered," he said, "how many women perform under stage names? How many theaters allow for reinvention? London is a city of masks, Watson, and the theater is its most crowded ballroom. But if she intends to remain hidden, why send this?" I gestured toward the note. "Isn't that a risk?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Risk is the applause of the cunning. It affirms that the audience is still watching." He withdrew a clipping from the Phylon advertisement for a new illusionist show at the Lyceum Theatre. The headliner's name was unfamiliar: Madame Vir, Mistress of Smoke and Shadow. The performance was to debut that very evening. Holmes turned to me, already reaching for his coat. "Shall we see what ghosts walk tonight?" The Lyceum was alive with velvet and gaslight, its entrance crowded with gentlemen in cravats and ladies in silk wraps, their voices a low hum of anticipation. Holmes and I took seats near the center of the orchestra, close enough to see every flick of the hand, every shimmer of fabric, every deception cast under the proscenium arch. The curtain rose. Madame Virelli appeared in a column of smoke. She was dressed in deep violet, her hair bound in black ribbon, her movements elegant and exact. The audience gasped at her first illusion. A rose set alight, vanishing in flame, only to reappear whole in a crystal box suspended above the stage. Holmes leaned toward me. "The hands are hers. So is the breath control. The timing, you're certain," I whispered, "as certain as I have ever been. The performance is different, but the philosophy is the same." The act continued. There was a mirror trick, reminiscent of the silver spoon, but reversed. The audience saw her reflection trapped behind the glass, while the real woman walked freely among them. Then came a knife illusion, a series of levitations, and a final flourish, a disappearing dove that left behind only a single white feather. And yet, through it all, the audience never applauded, not once. They were captivated, held breathless, suspended in wonder, but they never clapped. Not when the mirror vanished, not when the fire trick blazed, not even at the curtain's final fall. Holmes sat upright, eyes narrowed. "Did you see it?" "What?" "The trick behind the silence." I scanned the theater. Only then did I notice each seat had a slip of parchment placed discreetly beneath the cushion. The one under mine read, "True magic is not performed, it is perceived. Please observe in silence." The entire audience had been instructed beforehand. conditioned to respond not with sound, but with attention. A theater transformed into a gallery. A stage reimagined as a portrait. She had orchestrated still complicit, collective. Holmes smiled as the lights rose. A final proof that she's Velda. No, Watson, that she's unmatched. Outside the theater, the London fog had thickened again, casting halos around the gas lamps. We walked in silence for some time, Holmes with his hands behind his back, his head slightly bowed. She performed not for fame, he said at last, but for message. She did not want them to clap. She wanted them to understand. That's rarer than applause, and far more dangerous. Do you think she saw us? She knew we were there. She arranged our seats, printed the slips, chose the theater. Every detail accounted for, and the note. She wanted to remind me that the case wasn't mine to solve. It was hers to conclude. We stopped beneath a flickering street lamp. Holmes pulled the note from his coat and read it once more before folding it carefully and returning it to his breast pocket. I watched him for a long moment. You admired her, I said. He gave a small, unreadable smile. I still do. And with that, we turned and walked back into the night. Two men who had watched a ghost return not to haunt, but to create silence so complete it could never be mistaken for absence. It was the loudest thing I never heard. Chapter 16. The Trick That Never Ends. It was a quiet morning, some 3 weeks later, when Holmes rose later than usual. Emerging from his chamber with the appearance of a man freshly returned from a long voyage, not of miles, but of thought. I had grown accustomed to his abstraction in the days following Madame Varelli's performance. He had spoken little, eaten less, and spent long stretches at the window, silently observing London with the same penetrating gaze he once used to examine murder scenes. I expected him to resume our routine of pipe smoke, monographs, and occasional correspondence with Lestrade. But instead, he surprised me. Watson, he said, do you recall the illusion of the vanishing cabinet? I looked up from the Times, folded it neatly, and nodded. I suspect I shall never forget it. Holmes moved to the fireplace and removed the small framed card from the mantel. The Queen of Spades, its corners slightly curled, its surface now faded by lamplight. She built a trick, Watson, one that outlived its performers, one that transformed from illusion to confession to legacy. I watched him turn the card in his long fingers. But the question remains, he said. Why show it to me at all? She wanted to be seen, I offered, even if only by one man. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, but which self did she wish to reveal? The woman, the engineer, or the magician? He crossed to the desk and opened the drawer with a quiet decisiveness, pulling from it a stack of papers, his collected notes on the case, sketches of the cabinet, Spoon's ledger, Glint's final message, Velda's hidden annotations. He laid them out not as a scholar compiling a record, but as a stage manager preparing the props for one last performance. Let us test the structure, he said softly. I rose, drawn by the tension in his tone. What do you mean? Holmes sorted through the documents with swift precision. We begin with Spoon, a man obsessed with acclaim. He steals Velda's design, perhaps out of greed, perhaps fear. He senses Glint may betray him. He tries to trap the assistant, but is outplayed by Cragwell. Yes, Holmes agreed. Who sees opportunity where others see illusion? He ensures glint does not reappear. Then Spoon, now aware that the cabinet can do more than vanish its subject, senses he is next. He attempts to buy his safety, I said. Funds the Camden Theatre, perhaps believing it gives him leverage. But it only confirms his role in the conspiracy, Holmes replied. Cartwell closes the trap, and Velda. Holmes looked at me carefully. Velda allows it all to unfold. Not because she desired their deaths, but because she wanted her creation to speak in her absence. She placed the ring, the notes, the misdirections, not to confuse, but to clarify, slowly, elegantly, to those who followed the thread. He returned the papers to the drawer, then turned to the fire. Her trick was not to vanish, he said. It was to remain. I considered that in silence for a moment. Then, do you believe she'll return again? As someone else? A new illusion, perhaps. She already has, Holmes said, almost absently. Every theater that features a woman with mirrors and silence and control, she exists there. Not in flesh, perhaps, but in the art. He looked down at the card once more, then replaced it gently on the mantel. But I doubt we shall cross paths again. Her message was final. There was a long pause. I poured him a cup of tea and handed it to him. He took it without ceremony, his mind clearly still with the woman who had disappeared between mirrors and reappeared in silence. As I sat down, Holmes's voice came again, quieter now. Do you remember what Glint wrote, Watson? That the cabinet was always a door. Yes. Holmes stared into the fire. Most people spend their lives afraid of the door. But Velda built it, locked it, walked through on, vanished of her own will. I nodded slowly. You respected her. He looked at me. I understood her. And in that moment, I saw something rare in my old friend, something deeper than admiration, more enduring than intellectual triumph. Not fondness, perhaps, but recognition. Velda's sin had created an illusion to sophistication for applause. One not meant for the crowd. One designed for the one mind sharp enough to see through it and appreciate the beauty of its mechanism. That mind had seen it, and it would never forget. Postscript. By Dr. John H. Watson. In the years that followed, Holmes and I would encounter many mysteries, some tragic, some petty, some brilliant, but none quite like the case of the man who vanished from a spoon. There was no villain with a pistol, no corpse in the study, no blood on the stairs. Only a woman with a mind like a stage, traps, silent, intricate, hidden in plain sight. I never saw Velda sin again. Neither, I believe, did Holmes. But sometimes, when we passed the doors of a theater, he would pause, just briefly, and in his eyes I would see a flicker of something he rarely allowed himself. Wonder, the kind only a magician can earn.